Recently, President Trump and even the NATO chief warned India, China, Brazil of buying Russian oil because Trump has threatened Russia with secondary tariffs. The idea was to force President Putin to agree for a ceasefire. Well, this threat raises several questions. The first question is, who is NATO chief to make such kinds of claims and hurl such kinds of threats? Well, NATO is not a trade body. NATO is not a political institution. It's a military alliance. How can a leader of a military alliance threaten democratic sovereign nations? He has gone to the extent of suggesting Prime Minister Modi, President of China, President Jinping, and Brazilian President Lula to pick up the phone and speak to Putin and make him agree for a ceasefire. Fundamentally, this approach is flawed because it is a very simplistic way of looking at the complex question of Russia-Ukraine war. Already, United States is paying heavy price, especially Trump is paying heavy price for his inability to understand the gravity of the Russia-Ukraine war, understand the fundamental reasons that led to the Russia-Ukraine war. Now the simplistic solution is by giving more arms to Ukraine and by punishing Russia through economic sanctions and even punishing Russian trade partners through secondary sanctions. The Trump administration wants to make Putin agree for a ceasefire. But this is a flawed strategy given the experience for the last 3 years. And the sanctions are not new. There are around 20,000 sanctions on Russia. Russian economy did not succumb. So therefore, I don't think these new threats will really make an impact. Russia has made a joke of it. China has threatened to impose counter sanctions. Well, India did not react much. So the fundamental reason for this is, but what is the real intent behind such a threat? Even before coming to the real intent behind such a threat, let me tell you the hypocrisy and duplicity and double standards of the Western nations. Even today, the European Union depends on Russian natural gas to the extent of 19%. 19% of Europe's gas requirements are even today met by Russia. That's the reason our Foreign Minister Jaishankar long back said, what we buy from Russia in a month, you are buying in half a day. Well, it is true that India has been buying Russian oil, China has been buying Russian oil. Last month, Russian oil accounted for 43% of India's crude purchases. India is saving around $11 billion because of buying the Russian oil. Why will India lose this opportunity? It is not a war which we are responsible for, and neither we can do anything to stop that war. When President Trump and the European leaders can't stop the war, can India stop the war? So our energy requirements and energy security and our economy, these are more important for the government of India rather than the US foreign policy interest and US strategic interest. Well, that's the fundamental reason. But what is the real conspiracy? Real conspiracy is not just energy. Well, energy is an important aspect. The argument of the Ukraine and United States is that by buying Russian oil, you are actually, the Ukraine accuses countries like India and China of funding the Russian war on Ukraine. But President Zelensky and even Western leaders should know that the Western nations are also buying gas from Russia. They did not totally stop energy purchases from Russia. Are they also funding Russian war aggression on Ukraine? So this is a fundamental question they have to ask. But more than the energy, well, it will have very serious implications because Russia accounts for 15% of the global energy supplies. So therefore, the energy prices, especially the crude oil prices, are likely to increase by 20 to 30% if Russia oil is not allowed to be sold. Well, that is to what extent it is possible is another question. But if US succeeds, if NATO succeeds in preventing other trading partners from buying Russian oil, I think there will be at least 20 to 30% rise in the global crude prices. This will seriously jeopardize the interest of countries like India and China. Secondly, the other interest is not just oil. So the Americans have a law called Countering American Adversaries through Sanctions Act. This is a CAATSA Act. You may be remembering when India wanted to buy S-400A defense system from Russia, which proved to be very, very useful in the recent war with Pakistan. It was the United States which threatened of imposing sanctions on India. In fact, the US has imposed sanctions on China and its NATO ally Turkey for buying a similar S-400A defense from Russia. The government of India did not bother that, and we went on to procure S-400. But however, the United States of late has not imposed sanctions on CAATSA as for buying S-400. We were given exemption. Yet there is an interesting thing. After India and China, which is the third largest buyer of oil from Russia, it is Turkey, which is a Western ally, which is a member of the NATO. NATO chief is not realizing the fact that his own member nation, Turkey, is the third largest purchaser of energy supplies from Russia. So besides this hypocrisy, there is a larger conspiracy behind it. So the conspiracy is to reduce the share of Russian arms exports in the global arms market. Russia is one of the biggest players in the global arms market, along with the United States, France, UK, Israel, and China. Of course, we are also entering in a very, very small way by exporting BrahMos missiles, but India is a negligible player. But we are the second largest importer of arms, next only to Ukraine. So India has been actually depending on Russia right from the Soviet era for a defense procurement. At one point of time, 75% of India's defense requirements in defense import were met from Russia. Now it has come down to 36%. India has been diversifying its defense market. Rather, the United States and the Western nations were forcing India to buy arms from countries other than Russia. So even today, Russia accounts for 36% of India's defense requirements. So the idea of imposing sanctions on Russia are not just to weaken the Russian share in the energy market. The actual intent is to reduce Russian share in the global arms market and dissuade countries like India from buying Russian arms. So this is another important thing. Third is, well, they want to even weaken the China, because China is also the biggest beneficiary of cheaper oil from both Iran and Russia. We are not buying from Iran. At one point of time, India accounted for 10% of Iran accounted for 10% of India's oil imports, but due to sanctions and due to pressure from the United States, India substantially reduced. It is almost zero today. So, what China continues to buy the oil from Iran, China accounts for the 90% of Iranians' oil sales. So, China is the biggest beneficiary of cheaper oil due to American sanctions on Iran and Russia. So by imposing sanctions on the countries that trade with Russia, the United States wanted to even weaken the Chinese economy too. So on the process, they want to achieve 3-4 things. One, weaken the Russia's energy market. Two, weaken the Russia's defense market and increase the United States and Western share in the global arms market. 3, weaken the Chinese economy. And 4, weaken the Russia, India, China trilateral alliances. There is an arrangement called Russia, India, China. Well, due to our border disputes, this troika is almost not functioning. But more recently, Russia has been taking initiatives to revive this troika, Russia, India, China. So the United States has the largest strategic intent behind imposing so-called secondary sanctions on Russia and all the trading partners that buy not just oil but even defense equipment and other things from Russia.